One of the core questions in the study of international political economy relates to what are the conditions that allow for a global economy to emerge. And we're going to talk about one of the arguments behind this idea of hegemonic stability. So the hegemonic stability thesis says that you only get a global economy when you have an actor who has the resources and the willingness to provide critical global economic infrastructure. And that without that global economic infrastructure, a global economy can't function or can't survive. And so there's a couple different pieces here. We'll talk through these, some of which we'll go into much greater detail on later on, some of which I'll sort of flag now. So one of the things that you need is some mechanism to promote open markets, that countries oftentimes will have incentives to protect their domestic economies through tariffs. Oftentimes you only get economic integration and trade when there's some state pushing for that and advocating for that and creating space for that. Part of creating space for that involves maintaining secure trade lanes. So particularly ocean navigable trade lanes, protecting them against piracy, ensuring that they're patrolled and that they're safe, and that, you know, if ships break down, they can get repaired and towed back to port. All of that's really important. You may need to be able to provide liquidity through lending. What that means is that periodically you have financial crises, you have monetary crises, you have fiscal crises, you have all sorts of economic crises, and the sort of gears of the global economy can grind to a halt unless you have the ability to provide liquidity, essentially cash, to make sure that banks don't collapse and that things continue to operate. During the Great Recession, this was really critical. Banks were uncertain who was solvent and who was not. They had all of these assets on their books that they weren't sure if they were actually worth anything. And one of the things that the United States and others around the world did is they moved those assets that were considered toxic. Nobody would buy them because they didn't know how much they were actually worth, off the balance books of banks. And then the Federal Reserve in the United States held those assets. Banks were given cash, something that was liquid, something that they could use and spend and move around, and that allowed for banks to continue operating while the time it took to sort of sort out what those assets were actually worth was sort of held by the United States government in the form of the Federal Reserve. Turned out those assets were largely valuable. I think the federal government actually made money off of what was called the TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was about $700 billion of buying up these assets. But it was $700 billion that had to be funneled into banks in a moment's notice to prevent the whole financial system from grinding to a halt. So some mechanism to provide liquidity, cash in times of crisis, ends up being really important. You need some mechanism to create predictability in exchange rates. So ideally, if I take my pounds and I turn my pounds into dollars, my dollars into yen, and my yen into euros, and then go back into pounds, are the exchange rates stable enough that I will still have something that looks, relatively the same in terms of value by the time I've gone through all of those exchange rates? And if exchange rates are fluctuating wildly all over the place, or we don't know what exchange rates look like, it's going to be really hard to do business across borders. And then finally, you need some mechanism to coordinate global macroeconomic policy. So when you get into a Great Recession, or when you get into a Great Depression, that there's coordination and cooperation to encourage the global economy to sort of get out of that those doldrums, rather than doing what happened in the Great Depression, which was countries engaging in beggar thy neighbor policies, doing things that maybe advantaged themselves but came at the expense of everybody else, and collectively, when everybody was doing it, it made everybody worse off. And so there's lots of talk in international political economy circles about this idea of coordinating macroeconomic policy. And a lot of that is really expensive, right? The United States spends billions upon billions every year maintaining a navy to support open trade lanes. The TARP program, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, was $700 billion to keep banks in the United States and elsewhere afloat. There's a lot of cost that comes into this. And so hegemonic stability thesis says you only get that infrastructure when somebody's there who's willing to pay that cost, who's willing to enforce a global system and make all of that work. And one of the reasons why hegemonic stability theorists or by this idea is by looking at sort of the rise of a global economy in the 19th century and then its collapse. And so if we just look at sort of the volume of trade that was happening globally, in 1913, on the eve of World War I, there was a global economy. There was incredible trade happening around the world as goods moved from across oceans and through ocean shipping and through rail. And World War I essentially decimated that, in part because of the risk to vessels and to shipping, but also it was followed up by the Great Depression, in which countries pursued beggar than neighbor policies, threw up tariffs, and essentially the entire global economy just shredded. And part of that is that Britain had been providing a lot of that economic infrastructure in the 19th century. They'd patrolling trade lanes and suppressing piracy. They were the center of the global financial system, and so they were ensuring that the global financial system remained solvent in times of crisis. They had pushed for free trade. They'd done a lot of these things that made that system work, but after World War I, they were greatly weakened. The Great Depression further weakened them, and nobody really stepped into that void to continue providing that global economic infrastructure until after World War II, when the United States took on many of those responsibilities and created an infrastructure for cooperation around economic policy, and suddenly the global economy began to revive, and in fact didn't reach the level that we saw in 1913 until like 1990 in terms of global volume of trade. So we see that sort of rise and collapse and then rise again, and it seems to correlate or correspond with a hegemon who's willing to provide that infrastructure. In the case of the United States providing that infrastructure, a lot of the foundation was set at the Bretton Woods conference. And so people oftentimes will talk about the Bretton Woods system, which was a system that was sort of designed or planned out at a meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the end of World War II, that brought together the Allied powers to kind of talk about how they would sort of restructure the global economy in the wake of World War II to try to avoid some of the problems that were observed in the Great Depression, currencies being sort of all out of whack, trade being cut off by tariff barriers, and generally war and depression having impoverished huge swaths of the planet. And so to respond to that economic challenge, the Bretton Woods institution created three different institutions, or I guess two institutions and then an agreement, a treaty. So there was the World Bank, which was created to rebuild economies after war and to help poor countries develop and industrialize. So the World Bank is there for development and poverty alleviation. The International Monetary Fund was created to support a system of fixed exchange rates where countries would lock their currencies to the dollar and say a British pound is worth $2 and it will always be worth $2. And the International Monetary Fund was put in place to help make that system work a little bit more efficiently. We'll talk about currency and currency systems a lot more, so I won't go into the detail here about how that works. And then finally, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade came out of those conversations, a global trading agreement that would work to reduce trade barriers over successive rounds of negotiation. And so a lot of people will point to that Bretton Woods meeting and the establishment of these three pieces as the turning point in reviving the global economy. But people who are skeptical of this idea of hegemonic stability note that, yes, in the wake of World War II, the United States was overwhelmingly the dominant economic actor. I think roughly half of everything produced globally was produced in the United States at the end of World War II. But by about 1970, that was no longer the case. The Western Europe had recovered. Japan had industrialized and had recovered from World War II. The United States fell to only about 25% of the global economy. And it wasn't clear that the United States had the resources necessary to continue to maintain that system. It began breaking apart the fixed exchange rate system that had been put in place at the end of World War II, comes apart in the 1970s. There's oil shocks and all sorts of problems. And yet the global economy doesn't collapse, even though the United States is no longer in a position to provide all this global economic infrastructure. And so people push back and said, well, maybe you can get that global economic infrastructure through cooperation. And the argument is that once it's been put in place, that other countries will see a benefit to it and will cooperate and work together to try to maintain that infrastructure to ensure that a global economy continues and continues to hold together. And in the 1970s, as the United States sort of declined in its relative economic dominance, a lot of economic decision making in the global economy was taken up by the G7, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada, sort of 7 industrialized democratic nations, and that they coordinated macroeconomic policy. They had conversations about stabilizing exchange rates and dealing with energy shocks, and that they provided a lot of that economic infrastructure and ensured that things were prevented from pulling apart the way that they had during the Great Depression. But in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession, it was clear that the G7 didn't have the resources any longer to kind of play that pivotal role in the global economy. And a lot of the crisis response that occurred didn't occur through the G7, but through this other organization, the G20, which includes the G7 members. For a period of time, there was the G8 as well that included Russia. But the G20 included the broader European Union, as well as countries like China and India that were still developing, oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia, large populous countries that were sort of in that middle income range like Turkey or South Africa, Brazil and Argentina. So it was a much more diverse group of countries that were brought together to try to deal with the fallout of the Great Recession. And that really creates a question about whether or not the cooperative stability thesis that once this infrastructure has been put in place, states will continue to cooperate to maintain it, even if nobody can bear all the costs by their lonesome, if that really will continue to work, right? That the G20 being a far more diverse group of states that are not all unified under the U.S. alliance system, that may have strategic competition, the United States versus Russia, the United States versus China, China versus India, and also coming from a very diverse economic and political circumstances, right? Not all these countries are democracies, some are developing, some have interests in maintaining the global economy as it is, others have an interest in seeing really big changes. And so even though the G20 was the critical vehicle that responded to the Great Depression and ensured sort of cooperation to keep banks afloat, since 2017, the G20 has really been marginalized. The 2017 Treasury Secretary meeting deadlocked. The United States sort of walked away from supporting, even in principle, free trade. And those divisions between the United States and Russia, and even the United States and China have really magnified such that the G7 has sort of reverted to being the primary organization where economic management in the global economy takes place. And yet it's not clear, given that the G7 really was unable to handle the Great Recession, if that's going to work long term and if that global economic infrastructure is going to be able to be maintained long term, or whether we're going to end up in a situation where things start breaking apart because there's not the resources to sustain that infrastructure.